So yes, we're going to dig deep into sovereignty. Lynn, you talked about this a little bit earlier, but we're going to talk about it with the rest of the panel as well. I guess it would be useful just to start with a definition, I suppose, of sovereignty from each of your individual perspectives. And in defining it, just tell us a little bit about where your work, where your work sort of interacts with it. So maybe I can start at the end there with Colonel Ludwig. Tell us, in your words, what sovereignty means for you. We'll get into details a bit later, but just an outline for me, please.
Well, I think from a Swiss perspective, sovereignty is quite easy to understand. Sovereignty means power to the people. We have a democratic country, a direct democracy. We are voting every 3 months on different topics, important ones, sometimes not that important. That means that the citizen soldier in our country is the customer of everything you are doing, has to be able to decide. He's delegating his power to the parliament delegates power to the government, and so on at different levels. So things have been done right now in order to construct capabilities in space, not really in order to be sovereign in this perspective. So we need to be able to have at the end the decision when where people are living. From my country, of course, it's like something like 42,000 square kilometers.
Yeah. Okay. Next, tell us what does it mean from your point of view in your work?
Yeah, from my point of view, and this is from the perspective of commercial companies that are involved in providing space services. I mean, sovereignty is often defined by, in the United States, the military, and it really refers to, that autonomy and control. And that sometimes is in tension with what commercial companies are trying to accomplish. But generally, it's, from my perspective, it is really focused on what the government can and will control, and I think part of that equation is with commercial companies providing a diverse range of services. Again, there's a little tension there.
And Lynn, from your point of view, you have many customers, many companies, and also countries. But does sovereignty mean different things to different people?
I think it does. Sovereignty can mean I want to own the entire end-to-end infrastructure, or it can mean how do I partner and buy things from commercial that then I own and operate. And I don't think it's one or the other. And so as we're navigating the landscape of sovereignty, I think that there's a lot of opportunity for different countries and national agencies to look at commercial and say, where can I leverage things that exist and then build those into what my wholly owned solution will be.
Yeah, thank you. And Justin, just from your point of view then, what does sovereignty mean and how do you sort of try and execute it?
Sure. So first I'll say OrbitWorks is a joint venture with Loft Orbital based in the UAE. So we're based in Abu Dhabi. And we're building the Middle East's first commercial satellite production business. So when we're thinking about sovereignty, we're thinking about bringing capabilities to the UAE. That means control of the supply chain. That means where we can't control the supply chain, effective control or interdependence with other regional players. Our view is that there's still only going to be a handful of players, even though imagery may be more accessible. There's still only going to be a handful of players that have access to critical infrastructure, and strategic alliances are going to be a super important part of that picture. And the UAE is geopolitically and geographically uniquely positioned to take advantage of that.
And since we're talking about the UAE, just from your point of view, what is the importance of sovereignty? I suppose it's an obvious question, but what do you see as the sort of arguments you get from government actors that you work with about why they want this?
So I think the number of threats in the world is increasing very rapidly. The world, I think it's pretty unassailable at this point that we are deglobalizing rapidly, and that nations are becoming more nationalistic and looking inward at how they can build their own defense capabilities. And that includes, that's not just sort of weaponry and it's not just satellites, but it's a manufacturing capability as well. So that's how we think about it.
And Ludwig, the same question to you. I mean, you hinted at this earlier, of course, which is that citizens in your country are voting. They need information. They should have that information reliably. But just talk to me a bit more about, from the governmental point of view as well as the citizens, what is the importance of it? Why is it so critical to the way that your democracy will work?
Well, sovereignty and democracy, of course, is very specific for a country which is not member of EU, which is not member of NATO, and which should be neutral and with an armed neutrality. So our own history is based on the capability to defend ourselves against every neighbor. Sometimes it was coming from the east, sometimes from the west, sometimes from the north, sometimes from the south. Now it's not that easy to see from where the next threat will be coming, but there are threats. And for us, space is playing a role, of course, because nowadays you cannot imagine to defend your country without space, without space-based capabilities. Some of them owned, sovereign, some of them commercially available services and data.
Yeah. And what are the fundamentals of it? So just what kinds of things do you think, when you're trying to build this stack of information and also technology, what are sort of bits of it that are fundamental, do you think? And I'll ask the same to the others as well.
Yeah. The fundamental, the basis is the understanding of the situation. And for us, of course, it's space situation awareness, space domain awareness. If you don't have that, you're lost. You need to understand what's going on and to be able to foresee what could happen. Those are the basic capabilities you need in every operational domain, and space is no exception. The difficulty, of course, in space is that you cannot see, you cannot hear everything. You have only some points, some bits, some points of data coming through you, be it available on open source or be it commercially available. You don't have this opportunity to monitor the things the right way, like we needed to do some space traffic management comparable to air traffic management. That's the reason why General Shaw mentioned this morning the need for beacons, transponders, which is very interesting when you have classified satellites, of course. So you need to understand those things. You need to have the tools, sensors, software, database, infrastructure, ground infrastructure, specialists, and then change detection, analytics, artificial intelligence, and then, of course, to be able to show the people how it looks like. It was mentioned earlier, some colonels briefing generals in the morning. Well, it's not imagery from space that is relevant for the briefings in the morning. It's the change detection and the assessment of the change. Do we have to do something, or is it really going in the flow? So it's really this knowledge that is the basis of everything.
Lynn, change detection has been mentioned multiple times this morning already, and we're not even at the first coffee break. I feel like it seems to be the theme in terms of what security services and governments and things want. If you were building the fundamentals of what we're calling sovereignty, obviously that feels part of it. What else is the sort of base layer for a sovereign architecture here?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's all about the insights, whether it's change or not change. That's really going to help these nations get to the questions that they have. And so it really isn't about the imagery. It's about the answers you're getting. And in the case of Earth observation, that is a huge, huge component. I also think people is massive. It's taken the US, for example, 50 years to build the talent pool that we have around analysts and other types of people. And so when I think about sovereignty, it's about focusing the talent to the most critical mission needs that you want to keep in country first, and then building that long tail of how do you actually build a pipeline from a very young age of people who want to go into this industry and then are able to actually operate these systems.
We'll come back to the resources needed in just a moment, but Christian, maybe I can ask you, is there anything else you would add to the sort of fundamentals of what you need for sovereignty? Of course, there are lots of resources available in terms of companies now, in terms of satellites. The material's there, but if it's your responsibility to build a sovereign architecture in your country, what are the bits that you need that you haven't heard so far?
Sure. I think in particular, this came up, General Shaw brought this up earlier about the partnering with the commercial sector. And someone mentioned information and having the right information and essentially having reliable, credible, complete information, and the commercial space industry obviously is providing that to governments. You have to know what's going on. And I think second is also the resource piece of this. I think, there was the Space Force, their commercial strategy, for example, that was referenced earlier this morning, talks about supply chain security, or references it. And that's, to me, that's part of sovereignty, which is not being overly dependent on those essential resources that you need to, for example, ensure the safety of operations and your people. So I think it's that's how I view it.
Yeah. Justin, can I ask you, just again from your own experience working, where you're working, we've talked about the sort of architecture of what we might call sovereign, but, and the fact that there's there's companies out there that will sell services that many places will need, which maybe countries wouldn't be able to build themselves. But of course, you do need to control some hardware. You need to control something, even if it's on the ground. Talk to me a little bit about the resources you need on the ground, even if you are outsourcing much of the collection of data. What do you need to build these sorts of architectures at home to be safe and in your control?
So what we would like to do is partner with countries to give them the assets that they need so they can control it. So they're as vertically integrated as possible. One of the themes this morning has been layers of abstraction. Layers of abstraction means that you have essentially, let me rephrase. So what we're doing is building our vision is to put the cloud into orbit. Essentially, satellites are going from, I think there'll continue to be specialized pieces of equipment, but they're going from this, kind of abstract concept that people don't understand to orbital computers. And with that comes all of the hardware and software abstraction layers that we see in the cloud. And so as that comes to be, more and more countries will be able to access that architecture, and the human capital piece that Lynn mentioned becomes more, it's incredibly important, and it becomes more accessible to a wider range of countries.
So you mean things like data centers up in space, that kind of thing?
So that's happening now for sure. Amazon is flying constellations. Microsoft is flying compute as well. But data centers in space. But really, the model of a satellite is, ultimately, once you've got a major power constraint, but once that's overcome, which a lot of folks are working on, what you will have is an orbital computer with sensors attached to it. And its job will be to communicate, as folks have been saying on this panel, information instead of data. So communicating that information rapidly so it can be responded to, so it can be used to retask the satellite accordingly, so that ministries of defense can respond to changes.
Yeah. Ludwig, can I ask you, these capabilities are amazing, but do you still think that countries like yours, you still want your own computers, your own data centers on the ground, or other things that you own as well as this sort of commercial aspect of it all as well?
Well,
or do you not need that?
Your question is bordering some classified topics, so I cannot answer this directly. But as you can imagine, you have a control over a couple of things. You need to control your software. If you don't control your software, you have some black boxes. There cannot be any trust in this way. And especially with intelligent algorithms, that's the key element. You need to control your data. You need to be able to be redundant. You need to be able to have losses and still fulfill the basic functions. That requires something regarding the ground segment, the user segment, and the space segment as well. So you need those solutions with a national control. And for a small country without a huge territory, you have only two solutions. The first one is to go deep into the mountains, something I will love to do in Switzerland. And the other one, it's a mix to come from the ground segment to go to the space segment. And that's what we are seeing right now. Many more functions will go to space, will be done to space, computing, and so on. Why? Because in space, you are less vulnerable. That may be counterintuitive, but on the ground, you are highly vulnerable. And that's the case for different operational domains as well. If you take, for instance, modern aircrafts, they are highly vulnerable on the ground. When you have a F-35 in the air, it's not that vulnerable. It's quite secure and with many different capabilities. So this change from the ground to the space segment is for sure one important part of the future.
Yeah. Christian, maybe I can ask you without pushing into classified information in that case, but I'm just curious how, in your experience, when you see these architecture is being built. What is this sort of emphasis on mid-sized countries? Or I'm assuming superpowers want their own architecture and technology, and they want to control their own chips and all those things. But for mid-sized countries, smaller countries, is that so important?
I think it is. It's just as important as it is to larger countries, and I think that we're certainly seeing this.
Even when you can get all the information you need and the abstractions you need from the commercial sector and other places.
I believe so, because that drives how and when the information is utilized, and also it touches on the issue of when you have some type of exogenous event or a shock or something where there needs to be that architecture that drives what those steps are to control that information. And so the countries, even if they're small, have to have that framework, that architecture in place.
Yeah. Okay. There's a few questions on Slido. Firstly, right at the bottom, I'm not sure if we can answer this one quickly. Maybe someone talked about it on this panel. What is Microsoft doing in space? I didn't understand what was said. Did anyone talk about Microsoft? It was you, wasn't it?
Yeah. So Amazon Web Services and Microsoft are bringing their cloud into orbit, essentially. So they're flying in LEO compute and data storage.
Yeah. Okay. And I assume other cloud companies will do the same at some point.
The hyperscalers will continue.
Yeah.
I'm sure Zuckerberg will put up a constellation soon.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Another question. Does heavy reliance by government on quasi-monopolistic SpaceX create a national security risk? You can take whichever bits of that question you're interested in. Maybe Christian or Ludwig. I'm just curious what you think about that. Do you think there's a national security risk with relying on just one big company? At the moment, they're a big one and they're very useful.
It's interesting. It touches on something I mentioned earlier about the strategy for utilizing commercial space. In the previous decades, we had, I'm just speaking by analogy, we had a very small number of primes that worked very closely with, for example, in the United States, with defense and the military. And I think that those primes, because of the long relationship, they understood probably the national security threats in a way that some newer commercial companies in this era maybe don't necessarily understand. But I think that, so I think if you have a small number of, for example, commercial entities that are what we would consider sophisticated participants in the kind of defense market, thinking of that in terms of where your national security vulnerabilities might lie, they understand the threats, and that would be, I think, a relationship that would potentially mitigate those threats. I think what we're seeing now is, a wider range. There is a diversification within the commercial space and the number of companies that are working with militaries and governments that may not be as sophisticated. So I kind of actually think of it the opposite, which is the more participants you have that maybe don't have that legacy, that knowledge of the threats, that might actually increase the national security risks.
Ludwig, do you worry about any national security risks because of dominant players, or do you think there's enough diversification of the sector to?
I think right now we are seeing more opportunities than risk, but still there is a risk. We are working with different private companies developing a space segment and satellites, and all of them are flying with SpaceX, all of them. And for purely economic reason and for reason of availability and operational tempo and so on. So it's a solution working right now, but that could have some consequences. So there have to be alternatives. That's the reason why, of course, Switzerland, as part of ESA, is supporting the development of new launchers. And but there is no comparison. It's only a very small capability. Even with Ariane 6, it leads to the question if you are not supporting some zombie companies in Europe. Another point that is really important is responsive launch. I mean, the satellites that are the most dangerous in a dynamic operation context are the satellites not in space, but satellites on the ground, but ready to be launched on a specific orbit. It's like for a navy. The ships in not going on the seas are the one you have to look for. because they could be, after a couple of days, in any place. So that's the same in space. And you have to take this while assessing the different risks.
Thank you. Lynn, a question for you, I think, from the audience as well. Are satellites going to become intelligent, autonomous decision makers, as well as smart? In other words, heavily able to do heavy computations. I'm just wondering where you see the development of satellites and companies like yours and others as well.
Yes, I think satellites will continue to become more intelligent. There's the constant battle between mass and capabilities. And so we build a really small, between 50 and 100 kilometer or kilogram satellite, depending on the mission. And so as we think about the automation that we can build in to do things like onboard processing, so we can actually process on the satellite and then deliver much faster through direct downlink to customers, we'll continue to see a lot of innovation there. Will they become smart? Potentially. That will also depend on what type of appetite we have as a community for the satellites to do that much in space versus what they'll actually deliver on Earth.
Yeah. Justin, do you have anything to add? Where do you see the smartness? I mean, of course, the artificial intelligence, capabilities of satellites will increase. Which direction do you see it going?
I see it becoming as autonomous as necessary to maintain your capability. So that means in-orbit processing. That means in-orbit ability to operate a machine learning model. So in our case, what we're looking at is customers who would want to take their models, store it on the satellite, and use that model, a proprietary, secure model, to analyze their own images and that no one else can see, and then relay that information. And then as part of that, you're also going to have object avoidance, so collision avoidance in orbit, threat avoidance in orbit. So you need the ability, once you have more on-orbit propulsion systems online, they will be able to sort of steer themselves around. And also the retasking piece is going to be extremely important. So that means retasking between sensors in orbit, and it means retasking between the satellite and, say, drones on the ground that can be deployed to observe something more closely and faster than maybe a satellite could.
All of which requires even more rapid communications with satellites and between satellites. So that layer seems to be something that is incredibly important to build even more quickly. A question from the audience as well, which is, I think, a very good one for all of you, which is sovereignty a topic for the Western Alliance /EU and or for individual states? What's the role of commercial companies in this? And this is a good question because we've been talking so far about individual countries building their own sovereignty and defining it in their own terms and making sure that they are able to operate satellites and get information for their own needs. But of course, countries do ally with each other and often will do. Colonel, maybe you can start with this one. Where you must do both collaboration with other countries and also your own things. And I wonder where that line is. How do you sort of balance the two?
Well, that's a good question because, in fact, there's a gray area, but it's not that gray from the perspective you are considering. If you are in Russia right now, companies like SpaceX or IceEye or other ones, maybe BlackSky as you, are considered as enemies. And that's absolutely logical. There is no discussion. It's in the law. Armed conflict law allows attacks on those companies because they are supporting the war operations of an adversary. So in case of an alliance, and when you have some commercial companies, they cannot be outside of this perception. They are part of the alliance, willingly or not. So you have to accept the consequences of this close cooperation with states, maybe involved in military operations, in high-intensity conflict.
Yeah. Lynn, I'm curious how a company like yours operates. Obviously, you can sell your services to whichever countries you want. If two of your customers decide to go to war or use your information in that way, what happens?
It's a hard one. Obviously, we don't do business with denied parties, and really we try not to be part of the conflict. Our goal is to provide the transparency and the data to our customers where and when they need it, and that's why we offer people assured access on specific satellites or also having an optionality to have a sovereign capability where you do own those satellites. So they're yours, and we can't do anything with them. But fundamentally, as the world continues to escalate and tensions need to escalate, it is a really hard problem to solve as commercial companies as we think about what happens in the South China Sea and in other places like that. There's a lot of planning that goes on. There's a lot of planning specifically for us because we're a U.S. company with the U.S. government on how we will enable our capabilities based on those contracts. But at the end of the day, it's not for a commercial company to get involved on one side or another in any given conflict.
Yeah, I mean, of course, you don't want to get involved, but sometimes, as the Colonel says, that's just the way the definitions work, isn't it? Sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, there was a time where a lot of companies did business with Russia in the not too recent past, whether it was launch or imagery or other places. And so the dynamics of the world change really quickly, and the companies that make it pivot with the change.
Christian, I'd be interested in your perspective on this, about the line between individual sovereignty and keeping things to yourself and collaborations and cooperation between different countries, which for intelligence purposes happen all the time.
It does, and listening in particular to Lynn, she mentioned denied parties, and one of the ways that kind of thinking of this in terms of sovereignty and how that impacts commercial space companies, how countries now, I think increasingly, are exerting their sovereignty and controlling what companies can or can't do, even if the companies don't have a direct relationship with that specific country. And they're using national security regulations and laws that, and I think you touched on this, which is if you decide to do business with one country, that may result in doors closing in other countries. And it depending on...
There are consequences.
What's that?
There's consequences, basically.
Right. And so I think that landscape is becoming increasingly complex now that we have ongoing conflicts. Countries are using those rules and laws as tools to exert their influence and control over some of these commercial companies. So you really have to, commercial companies have to think through where and how they're doing business and the types of services they're providing very carefully.
Yeah. Another question from the audience. Will there be a limit in the future to the number of satellites we can put in orbit? It's a great question. And I think, Justin, maybe you can comment on this because, I mean, if you think about it, SpaceX wants to launch 40,000 satellites eventually. Other constellations are similar. There are constellations from China and other places as well. There could be hundreds of thousands of these things. Are we going to be able to see space at all after this?
I think we'll still be able to see it, but it's going to be a very crowded place.
Yeah.
Theoretically, there is an upper limit, but hopefully we don't end up looking like I guess Saturn because of all the stuff we put up there. But countries are going to continue to put up satellites until they have their own sovereign imaging capability, and so. You could argue, the U.S. I think and others are pursuing the constant gaze, but at some point the U.S. will be relatively saturated in terms of having all the capabilities it needs to observe anything globally.
But I guess the question from the audience member was more, what's possible to put up there, and are we worried about reaching that limit? I mean, of course, everyone's going to want it, and there might not be a market for more, but at some point, will there be too many, or how do you sort of manage that?
So. One of the hot topics these days is deorbiting, and so ultimately we don't see. I don't think we look at it as something where we're going to take all the space real estate anytime soon. That said, there will be things that are obsolescence that will need to be taken down. There are companies now spinning up who they're taking it as their job to pull obsolete satellites out of orbit. In fact, the U.S. Just passed a law recently saying that you need a deorbiting plan for your satellites as well. Within, I think, 5 years, you need to be able to deorbit your satellite or else you get fined. So we're trying to manage that, but I don't think that there's a limit necessarily.
The way to answer this question is you have a map of space. We don't have a map of space currently. We try to create it in our country and to show in every orbit with the mean altitude and inclination the density of objects and the number of conjunctions in those areas. And then you can say for some orbits it's really dense, it's really difficult to operate. For instance, nowadays, if you would like to put a satellite on 495 kilometers with an inclination of 50 degrees, bad idea. There's a filing of China for more than 3,000 satellites exactly on this orbit. So maybe go lower or higher. If you go higher, then you jump to the domain of the Starlink. So you have to find new place and then to avoid this high density of satellites. If it's everything well coordinated, like Starlink right now, it's like a highway and a high density hour, it will work. If it's not coordinated, if people don't talk to each other, which is the case right now between geopolitical blocks, it could be very difficult and very dangerous.
Ludwig, thank you. Christian, thank you. Lynn and Justin, thank you very much. We've come to the end of our panel. Can I have a round of applause for our panelists, please? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.